The machine had been running for 11 years without a break, and nobody thought to check the pressure gauges until Private Soon Adeyemi fell asleep at his post. That was how it started. Not with a declaration of war, not with a grand strategic miscalculation by high command. It started with a 23-year-old kid from Lagos, who had been on duty for 19 consecutive hours because his relief rotation was misscheduled by a spreadsheet error, who had been listening to a recording of his mother singing through his earpiece to stay awake, and who had finally, inevitably, lost the fight against his own eyelids, somewhere around 0300 hours, aboard the Resonance Processing Array Kestrel 7. The array had one job. The Veil Dominion, during the ceasefire negotiations of 2187, had agreed to one condition that the United Earth Compact demanded above all others: a device that would contain, process, and neutralize the accumulated spectral resonance of every Veil soldier killed in the 30-year war. The Veil called their dead, something that translated roughly as the unresolved. Beings whose violence-soaked deaths left a residue in local spacetime that, if left to build, would tear holes between the dimensional layers the Veil used for faster-than-light travel. Earth didn't understand the physics, just knew that if the machine ever failed, something very bad would happen on both sides of whatever divided the living from everything else. Soon Adeyemi slept. The pressure in Containment Chamber 9 reached critical at 347. The emergency klaxon sounded for 4 seconds before the overload cascade shorted the alarm panel. The spectral mass. 11 years of accumulated Veil war dead, something close to 40 million compressed resonance signatures, detonated outward through the hull of Kestrel 7 in a pulse that registered on every gravity sensor within 6 light minutes. Soon Adeyemi woke up on the floor of the control room, ears ringing, the air around him the wrong color. It was not a color he had words for. It was the color of something that should not be visible. He was on his feet, and at the console before he was fully conscious. The readouts were screaming numbers that didn't map to any scale he'd been trained on. The containment field was gone. The resonance was gone, escaped, dispersed, and in its wake, something was forming. Something the mass of 40 million compressed and violated Veil souls was becoming, in the space between. He had time to send one transmission before the lights went out. Message reached Fleet Admiral Taryn Osi 11 minutes later. She was in the middle of a debrief about supply chain disruptions in the Kepler corridor, when her aide put the tablet in her hand without a word. She read it twice, then she read it a third time, because the first 2 times she hadn't believed it. Kestrel 7, containment failure. Resonance release, total, dimensional membrane ruptured. Nature of rupture unknown. Recommend immediate evacuation of nearby sectors. Recommend immediate contact with Veil Ceasefire Authority. Recommend. The transmission cut off there. She gave herself exactly 3 seconds of stillness. 3 seconds to feel what she felt, which was a particular species of dread she associated with her first combat deployment. The dread of a thing having already happened that cannot be unhappened. Then she stood up, smoothed her jacket, and began issuing orders in a voice that gave nothing away. First reports from the outer colony worlds started coming in 40 minutes later. The dead were walking, not metaphorically, not in the hysterical way that phrase gets used in news feeds during times of crisis. Literally. Human beings who had died, some of them years ago, some of them decades, were standing up wherever they had been laid to rest or dispersed or stored, and they were walking or floating or reconstituting from whatever remained of them. And the ones who had died in violence were coming back violent. The ones who had died in war were coming back, armed with whatever they remembered carrying. The ones who had died in pain were coming back screaming. And they were not alone. Because the membrane that had ruptured was not selective. It did not distinguish between human resonance and Veil resonance. Every Veil warlord, every Veil conquest general, every instrument of 3 decades of war that had been killed and filed away in that machine came back with them. And they came back with access to Veil technology, because the Veil dead, apparently, remembered everything. Admiral O.C. watched the first composite report on a 3-meter tactical display and felt something she had not felt since the war. The specific cold clarity of a situation that was simultaneously worse than anything she'd planned for. and simpler than it looked because there was only one thing to do, and it was obvious. You fought. She was still organizing the fleet response when she got the second call that she hadn't been expecting. The voice on the other end, one she had not spoken to in 8 years. Not since the armistice signing. Not since the moment she had looked across a negotiating table and seen a Veil commander staring back at her with the same bone-deep exhaustion she felt in her own chest. Commander Keth of the Veil Ceasefire Authority. His translator rendered his voice into something just slightly wrong. The way all Veil-to-human translation sounded. Grammatically perfect and emotionally sideways. Like a letter, written by someone who had learned the language from books rather than from people. Admiral Osei, said Keth. The same thing has happened on our side. She closed her eyes for one moment. How bad? The unresolved that were contained in your machine, they have returned to Veil space as well. But changed, pounded. There is a being forming in the space between our dimensional layers. It is unlike anything in our records. It is consuming resonance. It is growing. What does it want? A pause that lasted just long enough to feel deliberate. We do not believe it has wants in the way you mean the word. It is what 40 million traumatized deaths become when they are compressed for 11 years and then released all at once. It is not a creature. It is an accumulation. Can you stop it? No. Our finest commanders engaged it at 04 Thrudo. They are dead. Osi opened her eyes. Outside the viewport of her command ship, she could see 2 of her destroyers running defensive patterns around a colony station where something was happening that the sensors couldn't categorize. She watched them for a moment. Good crews on those ships. Good commanders. Then we need to talk, she said. What happened next was not heroic in the way that histories tend to describe heroism. It was logistical. It was complicated by the fact that 2 species who had spent 30 years trying to kill each other now had to coordinate in real time. Across a communication array that had been designed during the ceasefire to handle trade disputes, not existential emergencies. It was complicated by the fact that OC's own council had immediate reservations about sharing tactical data with the Veil, and Keth's commanders had the same reservations in the opposite direction, and both of them were right to have those reservations given the history, and both of them were also, in the current situation, catastrophically wrong. Osi spent 45 minutes in arguments before she said something that ended the arguments. Every minute we argue, she said. The thing out there gets bigger. It is made of our dead and your dead, and there is no ceasefire for what it is. So you can either help me stop it, or you can watch it consume everything. But I am going to stop it. Or without you. There was silence after that. Then one by one, the objections stopped. She sent Commander Vasilieva and a small rapid response force toward the dimensional rift that Kestrel 7 had left behind, with orders to contain the spread of the resurrected dead on their side of the membrane. Vasilieva was 31 years old and had the remarkable quality rare in commanders of any rank, of being unimpressed by things that should have been impressive. She had been like that in the war too. Osi had watched her walk toward incoming fire once, with an expression of mild professional interest, the way a mechanic looks at an engine that isn't running right. Osi herself took a ship toward the rift. The rift looked like nothing. That was the most unsettling thing about it. It did not blaze or pulse or radiate visible energy. It was simply a place in space where the background starfield was wrong, where the light bent slightly, and the math stopped working, and the sensors returned readings that had no reference in any database. It was the size of a small moon. It was getting larger. Something was coming through it. The being had no name yet. It would acquire one later, from the Veil researchers who survived to study it. Something that translated approximately as the devourer who was made. But in the moment of its emergence, it was simply enormous and wrong. Enormous in the way that geological formations are enormous, not in the way that living things are enormous. And wrong in a way that was hard to articulate, but immediately, viscerally felt. The sensors on OC's ship registered its presence as a kind of static, a disruption of the normal background noise of space. Crew didn't need the sensors to feel it. They felt it themselves, in their chests, behind their eyes, an ancestral unease. It hit the first engagement line with approximately the force of a small tactical nuclear detonation. The shields held. Crews regrouped. It hit again. OC watched the engagement data and thought about the problem with the detachment that she had spent her career cultivating. The thing was not intelligent. Keth had been right about that. It did not have a strategy. It did not adapt. What it had was mass and density and a composition that made conventional weapons useless, because you could not kill 40 million resonance signatures with kinetic or energy weapons. The shots went through it and dispersed somewhere else entirely and came back out somewhere unexpected, tearing holes in the fabric of local space. 2 of her ships had already been damaged by return fire from their own weapons, redirected through the dimensional membrane by something that wasn't even trying. She needed something else. The Veil ships arrived at 1100 hours. They were different shapes from her own. Everything about the Veil was asymmetrical, built according to an aesthetic logic that human designers found disorienting, and they moved differently in space, using the same dimensional shortcuts that had given them their tactical advantages in the war. Keth's command ship was the largest, pulled up alongside hers at a distance close enough to be uncomfortable given the history, and Keth's voice came sishing through the channel again. "We have been thinking," said Keth. "So have I. The being is made of resonance. It can only be unmade by resonance that is stronger than itself, but no single resonance source is sufficient. We have calculated this." Ozzy was already ahead of him. "You need to combine them." "Yes. 2 resonance sources that are fundamentally opposed, human and Veil, would, in theory, create a combined signature of sufficient magnitude. Physics suggests that opposition itself is the key, not similarity. 2 things that should not be able to coexist, coexisting. The energy of that contradiction, properly channeled, would be enough to unmake it." A pause. "In theory. What does that require?" What it required, it turned out, was something that both sides had developed independently during the war, in secret, for purposes that were never used. The Veil called it resonance merging. Human researchers who had reverse-engineered a version of it after capturing a Veil technical database called it synchronization linkage. Both sides had built prototype systems that allowed 2 command signatures, 2 high-resonance individuals, to briefly merge their output into a single combined frequency. It had been a weapons program. The theory was that 2 commanders merging their resonance could achieve a strike capacity that no single commander could equal. Neither side had ever used it in the war, because neither side had ever trusted the other enough to stand that close. OC looked at the specs that Keth transmitted. She looked at her own engineering team's readout of the human version. Were not the same. They were built on different assumptions, different architectural principles. Merging them would require. She ran the calculation in her head, then asked her chief engineer to run it properly. Approximately 40 minutes of integration work, performed by people who would need to cooperate in real time across a species barrier, using equipment that had never been tested together. "You understand," said Keth, "that for this to work, one of our commanders would need to merge with one of yours." "Yes. This has never been done. I know. The psychological effects are unknown. The resonance interaction between human and Veil neural signatures has never been studied at this level. I know." Another pause. Eek. This time, she found herself wondering what Keth was feeling. Whether the Veil experienced this moment the way she did, as a weight, as a thing pressing down on the chest from inside. She didn't know. 8 years of ceasefire, and she still didn't know what Keth actually felt. She wasn't sure he knew what she actually felt. Maybe that was okay. Maybe that was even part of the point. "I will do it," said Keth, "if you will." "I will," said Osi. "I have a condition." "Name it. We do it right the first time. There's no room for pride here. No room for posturing. We go in as one thing, or we don't go in at all." A pause that felt different from the others. "Agreed." The 40 minutes of integration work was the most concentrated technical collaboration OC had ever witnessed. Engineers and Keth's technical staff worked through the shared channel, with a focus that left no room for the 30 years of bad history between them. Disagreements were sharp and brief, and resolved by whoever had the better argument, not by seniority or species affiliation. Chief Engineer Rosario ended up shouting at a Veil technician at one point, actually shouting, frustrated. Because the Veil harmonic calibration system operated on a base 12 number system, and the human system operated on base 10, and the conversion was eating time they didn't have, and the Veil technician shout back in its own language. And somehow that was better. Somehow that was the first moment that the thing between them felt like it might actually work. Two people who were both deeply frustrated by the same problem on the same side of it for once. Soon Adeyemi was there for the integration work. He'd been brought aboard OC's ship by transport after Kestrel 7 was evacuated. Quiet, still stunned, wearing borrowed clothes because his uniform had been shredded in the initial blast. He sat in a corner of the engineering bay and watched. And nobody told him to leave, and eventually, he started helping because he had been running that machine for 4 years, and he understood its output signature better than anyone. He didn't say much. He made small corrections. He handed Rosario a calibration tool at the exact right moment without being asked. When the integration was complete, Rosario looked at him with an expression that was not quite forgiveness and not quite absolution. Because those weren't the right words, but was something in the neighborhood of, "You are still here, and that matters." The synchronization linkage came online at 1248 hours. OC stood in the linkage chamber, a space her engineers had rigged up in 40 minutes using equipment from 3 different ships, and felt the connection establish itself. It was nothing like she'd expected. She'd expected something dramatic. She'd expected it to feel like being consumed or overwhelmed. Instead, it felt like turning and finding someone standing at your shoulder who was also looking at the same thing you were looking at. Keth's resonance, translated through the linking equipment, was not comprehensible in human terms. She did not experience it as thoughts or emotions. She experienced it as direction, as orientation, as the sense of a vast and different intelligence pointed at the same horizon. She thought, this is what it means to not be enemies, not friends, not the same. Just pointed the same way. The being had grown larger while they worked. It was now big enough that its gravitational presence was slightly warping the orbits of nearby debris. The engagement line had fallen back to 3 light seconds and was holding with difficulty. The resurrected, dead on the colony worlds were getting harder to contain. The teams Vasilieva commanded were doing extraordinary work, but they were exhausted, and the resurrected didn't get tired. OC and Keth went out to meet it. This is hard to describe in the terms that battle reports usually use. There were no ship-to-ship engagements. There were no tactical formations or approach vectors in the conventional sense. What happened was that 2 command signatures, one human, one Veil, merged into something that had no name in either language, moved toward an accumulation of 4 decades of war dead, and were recognized, somehow, by what they were approaching. The being had no intelligence, but it had memory, and the merged resonance of OC and Keth was made of the same stuff it was made of, just differently assembled, just differently directed. It turned to face them. The first exchange was devastating. OZ had been in combat before. She had been in the kind of combat where you stop being afraid because there is simply no room for fear in the available cognitive space. This was different. This was combat at a level that did not map to anything in her experience. The being struck with the weight of 40 million accumulated resonances, and what she felt was grief, overwhelming and sourceless, the grief of things that had died wrong and hadn't finished dying, and she understood for the first time in her career what she was actually fighting. Not a monster, an injury, a wound that the universe had taken in a war that 2 species had started and left unresolved. She thought that, and the grief became slightly lighter. Not gone, just lighter. Keth's resonance, beside her, was doing something she could not fully parse. She felt it as a kind of steadiness, a rootedness, the sense of something that had also seen a great deal of death, and had decided to be here anyway. She thought, I understand you a little better now. The being hit them again. The merged resonance field buckled and held. OC poured everything she had into it. Not the technical everything of a weapons system, but the human everything of a person who has been in a room with grief before and knows that the only thing you can do is not look away. Keth did something analogous. She could feel it without understanding it. The third exchange was the one that mattered, because what the merged resonance could do, what neither human nor veil resonance could do, alone, was resonate at a frequency that matched the frequency of the being's own composition. Not to fight it, to answer it. The way you answer someone's one who is screaming, by speaking quietly, but very clearly, in a voice that carries. Not because you're stronger than the screaming, but because you're more resolved. The being stopped expanding. Then it began to contract. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of sustained resonance output during which Osi could not have told you where she ended and where the linkage began, and whether the part of her that was holding on was herself, or Keth, or something that was neither of them separately. The merged entity poured everything into the frequency that was answering the being. The being's accumulated resonances destabilized. Pressed war dead, the 40 million violent and unresolved deaths began to decompose. Not to die, they were already dead. To resolve. Do the thing that Kestrel 7 had been built to let them do slowly, safely over years, but that they were now doing all at once, in 11 minutes. Because the frequency was exactly right. Because it took a human and a veil together to be exactly right. The being came apart like fog in wind. The membrane seal, without the being's pressure maintaining the tier, began to close on its own. The veil technical team confirmed it with audible relief in their voices, which was the first time Osi had heard anything she'd recognize as relief in a veil voice. The resurrected dead on the colony worlds simply stopped. Some of them were already dissolving as the resonance holding them together dissipated. Others, the ones who had died recently enough, who were less a function of resonance and more a function of simple matter, remained as bodies. That was a different problem. A slower problem, one that could be addressed without emergency. When the linkage disengaged, Osi sat down hard on the floor of the linkage chamber because her legs had decided they were done. Rosario was immediately there beside her, not saying anything, just present. The way good engineers are present in the aftermath of something hard. She appreciated it. She didn't have words yet. She had, instead, was an image. Keth's resonance beside hers in the dark, oriented the same direction, not the same as her, not comprehensible to her, but there. Pointed at the same thing. Keth's transmission came through 7 minutes later. The tier is sealed, he said. Our dimensional layer integrity is restored. The unresolved are. A pause. At yes. Admiral Osi. Another pause, this one with a quality she couldn't categorize, something that the translator wasn't equipped to render accurately. I want to say something. Go ahead. What you did. What we did. It was. The phrase we have for this does not translate well. It means a thing that should not have been possible that was done anyway because it needed to be done. She thought about that. We have a word for it too, she said. It's not a polite word. A sound from Keth that might have been the veil equivalent of a surprised exhale. Tell me, she told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he repeated it back to her in English, carefully, with the translator off, in his own voice. It sounded strange. It also sounded correct. In the linkage chamber, her crew started laughing. The kind of laughter that follows a thing that cannot be processed any other way. Osi was still sitting on the floor. She put her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and let herself, for the first time, in what felt like a very long time, just be tired. Tsunadeyemi was sitting against the opposite wall. He had been there the whole time. He was looking at his hands. Private, she said. He looked up. Admiral, you stayed at your post for 19 hours. Yes, ma'am. That was a failure of your rotation schedule. Yes, ma'am. She looked at him for a moment. He was young. See, he looked younger than 23, right now, sitting on the floor with his borrowed clothes and his hands in his lap. She thought about the investigation that would follow this. The inquiries, the reports, the chain of accountability that would wind its way through 17 layers of bureaucracy before arriving, inevitably, at the fact that a private had fallen asleep, at a post he should have been relieved from 12 hours earlier. You were awake when it mattered, she said. You sent the transmission. I was too late. You were the reason we had 11 minutes instead of 11 seconds. She paused. You knew that machine better than anyone aboard. You gave my engineers something that saved us time we didn't have. He didn't say anything. He was still looking at his hands. There's going to be a review, she said. It will be thorough. There will be consequences for the rotation error. Not for you. for the people who scheduled it. You'll be asked to testify about everything you observed. It'll take months. I know, after that, she considered. Shh. After that, I'm going to personally recommend you for the Resonance Systems program, if you want it. He looked up again. Why? Because you stayed at your post for 19 hours, listening to your mother's voice to stay awake, and when everything went wrong, you still sent the transmission, and you spent 4 years learning a machine that everyone else treated as infrastructure. She let that sit for a moment. That's not nothing, Private. That's not nothing at all. He nodded. He looked back at his hands. Then he looked up one more time and said, "What was it like, the linkage?" She thought about it. "Like talking to someone in a language you don't speak," she said, "but understanding them anyway." He considered this. He started over. Is that what the end of the war is supposed to feel like? She thought about Keth's resonance beside hers in the dark, oriented toward the same horizon. She thought about the Veil technician and Rosario shouting at each other over a base 12 calibration problem and ending up on the same side of it. She thought about the being coming apart like fog. She thought about 40 million war dead who had been compressed and pressurized and made into something terrible. Being given, finally, the chance to stop. I don't know, she said honestly, but it feels like a start. Outside, the memorial fleet was already beginning to assemble for the dead from both sides who had come back and were now gone again. It was going to be an unusual memorial. Two species mourning the same event from different angles, finding a format that worked for neither of them perfectly, which probably meant it was working. Vasilieva had already transmitted a request for clarification on protocol that ended with the notation, "No precedent exists for this situation, Admiral. So I am requesting permission to invent one." Osi had written back, "Granted." The rift in space was gone. The star field in that sector was back to normal, or close enough to normal that sensors couldn't distinguish the difference anymore. Some of the scientists were saying there would be long-term measurable effects on the dimensional membrane. Subtle things, things that would take years to study properly. And others were saying the closure had been clean. Neither side knew yet. They were going to have to study it together, which was going to require another year of negotiations about data sharing protocols and access rights and all the other careful, tedious, necessary machinery of two species learning how to coexist. It would be frustrating. It would be slow. There would be days when it felt like nothing was working and everything was broken. And the gap between human and Veil understanding was simply too large to cross. And then someone would get frustrated at the same calibration problem at the same time and shout about it in two different languages. And it would turn out they were both pointing at the same thing. Kestrel 7, damaged but intact, in emergency power mode, skeleton crew, the monitoring systems came back online at 1400 hours. The containment chamber was empty. The membrane was closed. The sensors were reading everything in the normal ranges. In the log, after the system restart, there was a brief notation in the automated field. Read operational status, nominal, which was, all things considered, the most human possible understatement for what had happened in the last 14 hours. Private Soon Adeyemi's personnel file would later note, in the language of military commendations, that he had demonstrated remarkable presence of mind under catastrophic equipment failure conditions, transmitted critical data under extreme duress, and contributed meaningfully to the technical resolution of a civilizational scale emergency. What it wouldn't note, what it couldn't note, because there's no box on a military form for it, was that he'd been listening to his mother singing when he woke up. That the last thing he'd heard before everything went wrong was something familiar in a place that was very far from home. That the transmission he sent, the one that gave the fleet 11 minutes instead of 11 seconds, had been written with hands that were shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular tremor that comes when you are fully awake at last and aware of exactly how much is at stake. He'd said, in the transmission, everything that needed to be said. He'd kept it short. He'd kept it accurate. He'd given them every piece of data he had. That was all. That was enough. It turns out that's often how it goes. Not the big moment of chosen heroism, but the small one. The one you don't plan for. One where someone has been doing a quiet job for a long time. And they're tired. and they're listening to their mothers as the machine explodes. And they wake up and they send the message anyway. Because that's the thing about humans. You can compress us. You can push us to the edge of what a person can hold. You can run the math on our limitations. 19-hour shifts. Base 10 arithmetic. Bodies that need sleep. Species that spent 30 years killing each other and had to be argued into cooperation by the weight of common catastrophe. We do the math wrong. We miscalculate in a direction the math doesn't predict. We send the transmission when we should be unconscious. We shout at each other across a species barrier about calibration errors until we're both so annoyed we forget to be enemies. We sit on the floor of a linkage chamber after pouring everything we have into stopping and something that should not have been stoppable. And we listen to a 23-year-old private ask whether this is what the end of a war is supposed to feel like. And we say, I don't know. But it feels like a start. The memorial fleet formed up at 1800 hours under a sky that had stars where stars were supposed to be. Commander Thaketh's ship was at the center of the Veil formation. He had transmitted a request through official channels for permission to observe the human memorial protocol, noting that his command did not wish to intrude, but wished to be present. OC had approved it in under a minute. In the human formation, the ships held for 3 minutes of silence. In the Veil formation, Keth did something that his translator told OC afterward was the Veil equivalent. Not silence, but a harmonic performed by the crew at a frequency too low for human hearing. A resonance deliberately kept small and interior. A sound that was really more like a held breath. Different expressions of the same thing. She watched the formations on the display and thought, this is the hardest kind of thing. Not the crisis. Crisis is terrible, but it has an end. The hard thing is what comes after. The slow work, the protocols, the data sharing negotiations, the day-to-day of two species learning that they're both here, and they're both staying, and they're going to have to figure out how to be that. That was the work. That was the real work. And it started now, and it would not finish in her lifetime, and that was fine. Most of the important things don't. Soon Adeyemi stood at the viewport of the medical bay. They'd made him get checked out, eventually, and looked at the stars. He was thinking about the machine. He was thinking about what it had contained. 40 million compressed deaths, and what they had been before they were compressed. Living things, alien, and incomprehensible to him, but living, with their own equivalent of songs their mothers had sung, and nights they'd stayed too long awake, listening to music through a device held against their ear. He was thinking about the frequency. What a human and a Veil together could be exactly right at. He didn't have a framework for it. He was 23, and he was from Lagos. And he had trained in resonance systems maintenance because the pay was good and the posting was interesting. He didn't have the philosophical vocabulary for the thing he was sitting with. He just had the feeling. He hummed something under his breath, his mother's song. The one she'd sung while he was growing up, first in the apartment on the 3rd floor, and then later in the house, with the good windows that looked out over the water. He didn't think about whether humming was appropriate given the day. He just hummed. Outside, the stars looked the way stars are supposed to look. Nominal.